This evening, Books and Books is honored to welcome back one of our favorite Miamians, historian Arva Moore Parks, presenting her latest book, George Merrick, Son of the South Wind. And here to introduce Arva, please welcome to the podium another great friend of Books and Books and the president of the Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Mark Trowbridge.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's presentation. I know we have many. How many of you are what I call an FOA, a friend of Arva? Where are our FOAs? Very nice, self-identifying. She just said to me, she's so typically Arva, she said, I can't believe people keep coming and hearing about my book. And I said, well, you know, there's a lot of friends of Arva that want to come and see you in person. So, as was mentioned, I'm Mark Trowbridge. I'm the president of our Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce. Our chamber actually just celebrated 90 years of serving the Coral Gables community. And I'm sure somewhere in this tome you'll hear a little bit more about that because Mr. Merrick had a singular hand in that founding back in 1925. For 30 of those 90 years, our dear friends at Books and Books have been a major part of the City Beautiful. When I first became president of our chamber 10 years ago, there were two folks at the top of the list that I wanted to sit down with and discuss things City Beautiful. One of those, of course, was Mitchell Kaplan, the owner and visionary leader of Books and Books, who we all love and adore, and the other, of course, was Arva Moore Parks. Now, I knew Arva a little bit from my days managing the Olympia Theater downtown. How many of you have been in the beautiful Olympia Theater? Sometimes we call it the Gusman, but I know better. She was our historic conscience and most stalwart supporter. We worked tirelessly for many years to restore the Eberson-designed atmospheric theater back to its original glory, and Arva was right there with us every painstaking step of the way. It was then that I really fell in love with Miami. Arva has a way of helping you do that. She is the rhythm that beats in our collective hearts. She finds a way to lovingly coax us out onto the dance floor, and she makes sure we say yes when asked, no matter what the ask. So that was the tone of our first meeting when I became chamber president. Her current labor of love at the time was the Coral Gables Museum, and she wanted a donation. Anything would do, but I should be a founder given that I was the president of the chamber. And so next thing you know, there I was at lunch writing a check. I don't ever say no to Arva, and I know that none of you do either. And the reason is, well, she never says no to us, to Miami, to our historic and rich past, and we love and cherish her for that. Tonight, we celebrate her latest milestone in labor of love, the life of our city and chamber founder, George Merrick. Merrick has been one of the many lucky men to grace Arva's life, and her passion for him is inculcated in every part of this wonderful biography. That is why we're equally pleased to announce a new program for our community called Coral Gables Reads. Our goal is simply to have each and every one of you, your family members, your friends, colleagues, neighbors, and the like, read this book at one time as a community, and then return here for a discussion of good old Mr. Merrick sometime in late January. We'll let you know that date. Now, this would make a great shopping gift made easy, one of Arva's books for, well, everyone on your holiday list. I hope you'll join us as we read together this holiday season, George Merrick, Son of the South Wind. And I can think of no better way to celebrate our community's visionary founder and our own personal treasure, Arva, as his storyteller. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Chamber and Books and Books, please give a warm welcome to our friend, Arva Moore Parks.
I want to thank Mark for that wonderful introduction. I'm trying to think what I can ask him for next. No, I thank you all for coming, and I do wonder sometimes that I feel like I've spoken to everybody I know 15 times, but I really appreciate your coming, and it's wonderful to see people I haven't seen in a while, people I've worked with, people I've known about, care about, so thank you all for coming. You never write a book by yourself. There's so many people that have been involved in making this happen. I'm sorry that before I begin, I hope you'll read the acknowledgments and the intro, because I've listed a lot of people who have really, really made a difference, who've given me pictures, who've given me information, who have held my hand in bad days, just on and on and on. But there are two that I particularly have to mention. First one is Mildred Merrick. Mildred Merrick is the one that really made this book possible for me. She was the widow of Richard Merrick, George Merrick's youngest brother. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her, but she was a research librarian at the University of Miami for many years. And that's when I first met her, when I was in graduate school. And the second one, of course, is my late husband, Robert McCabe. The two of them, unfortunately, were not around to see the hardcover book, but they read the manuscript, chapter by chapter by chapter. They edited. They made remarks. They would say, "Why did you say that? It doesn't make any sense." So they were really, really very helpful in doing the book. I never dreamed that I would write a biography of George Merrick. But as I look back, it kind of seems almost inevitable that I would. First of all, I grew up in Riverside, now Little Havana, and my parents belonged to the Coral Gables Country Club. And I even won a dog show there one time when I was very little. I dressed my dog up in an outfit and they won a prize. But I learned to swim at Venetian Pool, and I was enchanted with it then, and I still am. I went to day camp at Salvador Park, and a bit of a tomboy, I spent a lot of time climbing in the trees on Columbus Boulevard. The best trees to climb in Miami. When I was in the 4th grade, I moved to Miami Shores. And what I did, I moved into an old Mediterranean-style house. Didn't know anything about that at the time. But what I found out later, it was designed by Richard Keenel. And Richard Keenel, I think, is the most important architect of the 1920s and Coral Gables. And he also did Miami Shores. So I think living in that house and living in a Mediterranean-style house, I began a love of architecture. And it just made a big difference in the future. I look back. I also went to a downtown church, and everybody a lot went to downtown churches, and people came from all over town. So I knew people in all the high schools in Miami, and that it's too bad we don't still do that, because it was really nice to know people across town. But the next big change happened when I went to college, and I was going to be a teacher, like most of my generation. That's what you were supposed to do. I was a history major. I was going to be a secondary school teacher, and I ended up teaching at my old high school, Miami Edison. And one day I went into the teacher's room, and on the bulletin board there was this announcement where you could go to the university, you could apply to go to the University of Miami in the summer, 6 graduate school credits, and $135. And I was very poor in those days, and I think it probably, to be very honest, the $135 probably appealed to me more, because I'd been working winter and summer, and I wouldn't have to work that summer. Well, that particularly, I applied, I was accepted, and that really changed my life, because the professor teaching was Dr. Charlton Tebow. And some of you, anybody here have him for a teacher? Yeah, he was an amazingly wonderful man. He wrote the major Florida history book, which still is the major Florida history book. And he was getting ready to retire, and he was looking for someone to kind of pass the local history, Florida history torch to. And I laugh and say, and there I walked in. And after the summer session, he was very complimentary. I went up to him and I said, "Do you think I should go to graduate school full time?" He said, "Yes, I'll get you a scholarship and an assistantship, another $130 a month." So I didn't even take the graduate record exam. He got me in. Then I took the exam and then got in, fortunately. And so I started graduate school at the University of Miami. He encouraged me to do something on Miami history. So I did my master's thesis on Coconut Grove, which was the earliest settlement in South Florida. And because of that, one of the first, the Monroe family I met, Dr. Tebow set me up with Mary Monroe, Charlie and Bill Monroe's mother, and that prompted my first preservation effort down the road of saving the barnacle. So this is all coming together. But he also introduced me to Eunice Peacock Merrick. Now, Eunice Peacock Merrick was George Merrick's widow, and she was a peacock of the Peacock Inn of the founders of the Grove. And we had a wonderful time talking, mostly about the peacocks, but George Merrick's name snuck in occasionally. In 1970, I moved into a beat-up old house on South Greenway Drive. And it's hard for people, you tell them today, people thought we were crazy. They said that part of the Gables is the declining neighborhood. Don't ever buy anything in the Gables north of Coral Way because it's all going to be, just bad. Well, what I found out later, it was a Walter DeGarmo house. I didn't know it at the time, but again, who was probably the best local architect. Keenel, I would say, was a national architect. So here I've lived in these two incredibly Mediterranean-style houses, and I can pat them and think about them to this day. In 1973, Don LeBrun, who was the administrative services person for the city of Coral Gables, I'd met him at History Miami, then the Historical Museum of Southern Florida, and Dr. Chabot had gotten me involved in that too. And Don, had started the first preservation ordinance in South Florida, and one of the first in Florida, actually. And he knew me from now History Miami. And so he recruited me. Dr. Amaris was the first chair, but he only lived a very short time. So for all practical purposes, I was the first chair. Nobody knew what they were doing. It was like, what is preservation? What is this? But in that time is when I called the National Trust out of the blue for help. And that became another wonderful idea. One of the first things we did, the Merrick House. Duh. It was in terrible repair. Some of you probably remember when the roof was falling in, and Mr. Philbrick had bought it and sold it and saved it, but he hadn't really preserved it. And he was a very interesting man. Some of you may have known him. He was a very interesting man, and he got people irritated at him frequently. But I give him all the credit in the world, because if he hadn't bought the house, it would be gone. So we went to work with the help of the National Trust to convince the city to buy the house. And we succeeded. And so the city of Coral Gables bought it from Mr. Philbrick. And that's with the help of the Junior League, we began to restore the interior. That put me back in contact with Eunice Merrick. But more importantly, it put me in contact with Richard Merrick. I will never forget Richard Merrick, even though he was 17 years younger than George. Everyone has told me since and then that he was the most in the family like George. And they were very, very close. Later on in life, they traveled together. He was a professor of art at the University of Miami. He was an artist. He was a writer. And he was very handsome, just like his brother. And he was old enough to be my father, but I will never forget, we invited him to the Merrick House. He was born there. Okay? He had a white guayabera before people were wearing them all the time, white pants, white hair, white beard, and he drove up on a motorcycle. And when he came in and sat down, we were all like groupies. He was gorgeous and very charismatic. Well, he's the one that began to tell us a lot about George and about particularly Althea, George's and Richard's mother. Althea Merrick was the Fink. The Fink family is the family where all the artistic talent is. And I always say Grandpa Fink is the man over the fireplace, if you've been to the Merrick House. And he had a tremendous influence on George. And he was a Methodist circuit riding, charismatic, hellfire, damnation minister. But then he started manufacturing Fink's magic oil. So he became a snake oil salesman. And he used his marketing skills and became very rich. And the people in the Merrick family always said that George got his marketing skills and his charisma from Grandpa Fink. Well, when we cleaned out the house, there were some letters and documents. And I remember there were some letters written by Althea. And I put them in a cabinet like a display. I read them probably because I'm kind of compulsive about that. But again, never realized I'd be doing this sort of a book on George Merrick. But I don't forget anything. And years later, I went and found them and read them. And oh my gosh, were they important in the book. Mildred Merrick, as I said, was a librarian. And when Eunice Merrick became infirmed, it was Richard and Mildred that looked after her. And in her garage, there was a stash of material. that no one had ever really seen. And she had never even mentioned it. Lucky for all of us, it got left to a librarian. And Mildred Merrick realized what it was and preserved it. Then one day, lucky Arva, she called me. And she said, I have this group of material I'd like to share with you. Would you like to see it? Duh. So for about 2 years, about every other week, she came to my house and we went through everything and put it in order, put it in acid-free folders, plastic folders, to get ready to preserve it for all times. I made Xerox copies, so I had it, of course. And that's when it dawned on me that I had to write a book on George Merrick. In graduate school, of course, Dr. Thibault taught me the value of primary sources. But the primary source extraordinaire in all of this, in this collection, were short stories. George, as you know, and as I'll mention a little later, lost everything in the Depression. And he never lost his spirit, and he never lost, I don't know why, he kept his good spirit about everything. But in the 30s, he was writing a series of short stories. And at the time of his death, he was only 55 when he died in 1942. He was in the process of working with an agent to get them published. Well, what I realized with my background, they were eyewitness accounts. They are autobiographical, particularly of his early years, because he was 13 years old when his family came to South Florida. They had been living in Duxbury, Massachusetts. He was going to a fancy prep school on his way to Harvard when the terrible freeze occurred, and one of their 6 Merrick children, 5 then, died. And Grandpa Fink came to the funeral, and Grandpa Fink had been selling Fink's Magic Oil in Miami, Florida, the new city, 3 years, 1899 we're talking about, and told him that this was where the sun always shone. So sight unseen, Solomon Merrick bought 160 acres in what was called the back country of Coconut Grove. And George came down at 13 and began working in the fields, working with the black Bahamians from Coconut Grove, who became his very close friends in the fields. And that is the beginning, really, of the Coral Gables part of the story. Well, I had all of this incredible primary. There were clippings, there were speeches, there were all kinds of things and clippings and scrapbooks are very valuable. I mean, I read a lot of newspapers, but when somebody clips, they're telling you this is important to me. And so that helps you understand the person. But again, one of those lucky things, my good friends, Bob and Adele Graham's daughter married the son of the famous historian biographer David McCullough. So I got to sit down and get to know David McCullough and talk to David McCullough. And when we first started talking, Harry Truman was coming out, which is such a fabulous biography. And he said, well, the most important, I asked for advice. I'm thinking about writing this biography of George Merrick. What advice would you give me? He said, get him behind your eyes. He said, you have to know everything about him before you begin. You have to know his family background. You have to go where he lived so you can write about what he's seeing, what's getting behind his eyes. So I started a really lovely time of checking out, traveling, and doing research. I went to Maryland, where the Merricks began, had wonderful people helping me, had wonderful newspapers, documents, loaded with primary. Then I went and followed Grandpa Fink's circuit in the southeastern corner of Ohio. I went to every church. They're still there. They don't tear things down like we do. The parsonage was there. Some of the newspaper clippings talking about his sermons. Then I went to Gaines, New York, which is where Solomon Merrick's first church was. It's around Niagara Falls. And there I hit the jackpot. Church records, minutes, newspapers. Then he did very well in the Solomon Merrick, and he was recruited to Duxbury, which was Pilgrim country. The monument to the Pilgrims is in Duxbury. And the congregational minister, the congregational church, Solomon went to Yale. The congregational church is, the Pilgrim church, is the beginning of the Pilgrims. And unfortunately, I also learned in the process that I think Solomon Merrick suffered from what today we would call depression. It wasn't called that then, but I think it's pretty clear that he was clinically depressed. And Althea did a lot, who was this vivacious, bubbly woman, covered for him. And she even preached for him. And you think about that. She preached in Duxbury, Massachusetts. And she even preached other places in Gaines, New York, when he had one of his spells, as George called it. Well, research is fun. Writing is work, as some of us in this room know. But you can research all your life. You can carry all this stuff, but it doesn't really make sense until you write it down. And I use note cards like I learned in about the 8th grade, and I still do. And I have million note cards. And when you get ready to write, after you take notes on everything, you can shuffle them and get it really organized and make an outline. And so that's what I did. But the other thing I did is George was telling me things. He was a planner at heart, and he was a philosopher. And so what did I have to do? I had to read Ruskin, William Morris, Ebenezer Howard. I had to read the great planners, the great philosophers, because George was quoting them. And George believed in their philosophy. He believed, like Ruskin, that the middle class deserved beauty just as much as the rich. And I love to tell you things you don't know about George, but when he began the city of Coral Gables, it was for the middle class. And Ruskin and Morris believed in using native building material, native people to build, coral rock, lithic limestone. And in the beginning, every house was to be coral rock. And if you drive down Coral Way, you can see a lot of them are still there. And fortunately, the city of Coral Gables has a thematic coral rock historic element now, where they have made a point of saving the coral rock. So I've spent all these years writing about George, and I learned a lot of things. I don't like to correct other historians unless I also correct myself. And I've been correcting myself because all of us use kind of the same 3 or 4 secondary sources. And the thing that Richard Merrick even told me, that George never got his dates right. So even George was giving wrong dates. And you went to the newspapers and you did your primary research so you could get your dates straight. For instance, they really did come in 99. Half the time George said they come in 98, but they really did. I got that proven. He never wanted to create a city. So if you say he created the city, he did, but he didn't do it on purpose. He wanted to create the master suburb of Miami. He wanted it to be like Shaker Heights, which is still part of Cleveland, Ohio. Of course, I went there too. All the places he told me, he referenced, I had to go there. He also mentioned Roland Park outside of Baltimore, which is part of Baltimore, and is very close to where his father grew up. Of course, I went there too and found the Alhambra Water Tower in Roland Park. I said, oh, I know that. But that's the kind of thing that I did. There was no this is really important. There was no Coral Gables Corporation until 1 month before the city of Coral Gables was incorporated. Before that, he owned everything himself. He built all the entrances and plazas himself. He paid for it. And in 1925, he could have sold, 1924, he could have sold what was left of his land for what today would be almost $1 billion in today's, multiplying by today's money. And he wouldn't do it. It'd be like selling your kid. He would not. It was his baby, and by George, he was going to do it like he wanted. So there was no, and as late as November 1924, the city of Coral Gables was created in 25, April. As late as November, he was a major advertiser. I mean, the Herald must have, the news, they were just full-page ads, 3 or 4 times a week, full-page ads paid by George Merrick. In November 1924, he wrote a full-page ad against Coral Gables becoming a municipality. So that late, he was still trying to keep it from becoming a city. When he realized that it was inevitable, then he switched and went along, and that's when he created the Coral Gables Corporation. And then the city of Coral Gables and the corporation began to finish, particularly south of the highway and south of Bird Road, began to pay for some of the streets and things like that down there. But north of Bird, and even down as far as UM, most of that was done primarily by George. He loved Coral Gables. He poured his life into Coral Gables. And when the Depression, this is another myth, the great hurricane of September 1926, it did kind of kill the boom, although the boom was waning already when that happened. But it didn't stop George Merrick. He was probably the only major developer that continued to pour his money into trying to keep Coral Gables going. He lost his fortune really between 26 and 28. He poured it in. And people were having their homes foreclosed. He did overextend. He did sell too many lots, take the mortgage back, that sort of thing. No question about it. And in 1928, they threw him literally out of Coral Gables. In 1925, when the city was created, they elected mayor and alderman. He could have been mayor. He said, no, thank you. And Doc Dammers, his chief salesman, as you know, became mayor. But he was on the commission. They had a recall election in 1928 because people were losing their homes, losing their money. And there was Mr. Scapegoat, they get George. So they had a recall election. And I must say, it's the kind of thing that we would have investigative reporters writing about today, because the whole Coral Gables Commission was the Coral Gables Corporation. But they had a recall, and everybody was thrown out except George. And he could have been mayor again. And he said, no, thank you. But by this time, he was having some personal problems, mainly alcohol. And he wasn't perfect. Some people laugh and call him St. George. He was not St. George. And when you read the book, you'll find some other things to do with women and wine and, whatever. But he missed a lot of meetings because he was in rehab, basically. And so they wanted to get rid of him, and they threw him out, saying he missed too many meetings. So he was literally thrown out of Coral Gables in 1928. The other thing that I'm always correcting people on this, he never used the term City Beautiful, even though he read the City Beautiful movement, and the Columbian Exposition was very important to him, the 1892 Columbian Exposition, where most people say the kind of City Beautiful movement got its impetus. It was used, he used the philosophy, but of course he didn't want a city, so he wouldn't call it City Beautiful. But shortly in the 30s, really, the term City Beautiful began. So when we talk about George Merrick creating the city, you could almost say that, but we historians, we have this nitpicking part of us that likes to make sure that is not really true. He tried to start his own company for a while. his wife, who ended up, I tell the love story. I've spoken on the love story, and she's probably the only woman in Miami that gave him a hard time. And he did love her very much, but she was not easy. And she was a very devout Christian Science devotee and did not believe in alcohol at all. So the more he drank, that caused serious problems in the family. And but I must say, she hung in there with him through the very sad times. And I think at the end of their life, they were very devoted. The love was very much there, and they were back, like this. But he tried to start a company. It failed. Keep Coral Gables, George Merrick Incorporated, it was called, where he still had some land he was trying to sell. But his mother died in 1937, and he didn't even have the money to pay for her funeral. That's how broke he was. He was broke. And so, from a billionaire possibility to nothing, and he never got bitter. Go figure. Anyway, in 1941, he wanted to get enough money to live and to pay his mother's funeral expense. So he took the exam to become postmaster. And it was a competitive exam. And guess who had the highest score? George. Even though he didn't go to school much, he read constantly. And I always said that's the other thing I had to do. He read so much great literature that even things that I'd read myself in school, I'd go back and reread because he used all these literary metaphors when he wrote, and I had to go back and read the book to be sure I fully understand, what he was saying. He became postmaster, and that's another interesting thing. The postmen loved him. He was not a snob. He was an absolute everybody matters, black, white, rich, poor. One of the first things he did is he got equal pay for women in the post office service. Now, that wasn't being done in that era either, as you know. I'm sure Althea was whispering in his ear, and probably Eunice too. But he was very, very popular with the postmen because he treated them with respect. Sadly, the Merrick men had bad hearts. And when I went back and did all my research, they were all dying 40s, 50s, very early. Richard was the youngest, had a bypass, and lived to be into 80. But George was only 55 when he died of a heart attack while being postmaster in 1942. But when he died, it was front page on both the Herald and the News. The pallbearers were the postmen. The honorary pallbearers were big-time people in Miami. And the funeral was at Plymouth Church. And he had kind of become a Christian Scientist, too, with Eunice. But, of course, his background was all in the Congregational Church. And so it was at Plymouth. And the speaker was also the man from the Christian Science. I'd like to read just a couple things from the book, and then if you have any questions. The first one is, and this gets back to what David McCullough said to me, and it was written, an impression of George Merrick in 1925 in the paper, Miami Daily Tribune, which was another newspaper. What manner of man is this George E. Merrick? Dreamer, which he was, yes, and more. A dreamer with the faculty for surrounding himself with men to translate his dreams into practicality, into buildings and lakes and waterways. He built 40 miles of waterways and beautiful landscapes, into flowers and shrubs and homes. He planted 30,000 trees in 8 years. And I think when you think about it, the most important thing about Coral Gables that sets it apart from any other planned community really in America is the landscaping. And into churches and schools and institutions of learning, and beaches and playgrounds and cities. Writer, poet, his first book of poetry came out before he did Coral Gables. Dreamer, philosopher, lover of all things beautiful. He did say beauty can be made to pay. Creator, thinker, kindly, courteous, good-natured, gregarious human being. All of these can be applied to George Merrick. Well, my goal was not just to write the history of Coral Gables, which I, of course, love doing. It was to talk about the city, to talk about planning, to talk about what made it special, to hopefully, because what I learned is when you look nationally, people don't really put Coral Gables. There's one new big fat book on planning that's got it in it recently, but many of the books written some time ago never even mention Coral Gables. And so my goal was to not only tell the story of George and Coral, but to tell the story of planning, but to get it in a national highlight, national recognition. Because look at it. Isn't it an amazing place? The next thing I would like to read, and when I told you that even though he lost everything, he never lost his spirit. He kind of disappeared for years between 1928 and into the 30s. But then people began to appreciate, even way back then, the beauty of Coral Gables. And when it had its birthday, its 25th birthday, I guess, they invited him to speak. And he came, and they said nice things about him and about Coral Gables. And when he spoke, he didn't speak about Coral Gables' past. He spoke about his future. He predicted that as long as the city followed his original plan, Coral Gables would continue to blossom. It would fill in to the bay. Now, I can even remember as a little girl when there were lots of sidewalks and nothing else south of Dixie Highway. The business district would expand and experience enormous growth. So when people say, George Merrick wouldn't like this, sometimes I don't even like to say, well, I hate to tell you this, but I think he would. Despite the accolades, it was a very bitter, but he did understand for the first time that his dream had come true, that Coral Gables had made it. When he died, and as a final tribute, and this is what I'd like to kind of end with too. This was in the paper. When George E. Merrick, in whose mind and heart Coral Gables was conceived, and whose through genius it was brought into being, has departed from among us. And we, who are left to carry on and protect the ideals he established, that is how we pay tribute to his memory. Well, what's going on in Coral Gables right this minute has kind of got me energized. Because I feel like in many ways there's an intrusion as we speak of modern architecture into the historic eras. Now, I think they're south of the south part of Coral Gables. It's appropriate and fine. But I went berserk recently when they passed, the architectural board passed a very modern house on Segovia, which is very much in keeping with George's original plan. Why has Coral Gables? I'm very secure and firm in saying I know why Coral Gables is still Coral Gables. First of all, it's the plan. But secondly, it's strict zoning, and people complain about it, but it needs to stay. But most important is the architectural board. And when George sold the first lots in 1921, long before there was a city, nothing happened that he didn't approve of. And his architect, George Fink, his first cousin, and Denman Fink, his uncle. And so from before there was a city, there was an architectural board. And every plan is supposed to be, well, I met before the architectural board and I was not impressed, this current one. They kept talking about, well, this street is not declared historic, but they're not the preservation board, that's another board. But if you read the zoning, it says very clearly that the role of the architectural board is to keep in context with the neighborhood and the scale and blah, 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 blah. So they clearly were violating, in my opinion, zoning. But the last thing that has kept Coral Gables, are people like sitting in the audience. It's the citizens. And if they ever stop showing up, yelling and screaming, and filling the chambers, then we will have lost it. But I'm not seeing that happening, and I hope it continues. And I think that the commissioners understand it's going to happen. So I guess following what was said at George's death, I think all of us, whether we live in Coral Gables or not, it is a very special place that's in our midst. And it's up for all of us to listen to my man George and to keep it going. So thank you. Do you have any questions, anybody? Don.
Arva, you've spent so much time with Mr. Merrick. If you should meet him on the street, what would you want to ask him?
First I call him George. Gosh. What do you think of Coral Gables? I guess that would be just like they did at the meeting, one of the last places he spoke. And I don't ever like to say what I think he would say, even though I kind of hint at maybe there were some things he wouldn't like, but an awful lot I think he would. But that's what I would like to say to him.
Is there anything you'd ask him about his life or maybe blanks that you've wondered about?
I did so much research, Don. I didn't have a lot of blanks. In fact, I have what I've joking a lot of dumb luck and all of this too, and things just kind of fell in my lap. George Fink, who's one of the people I've kind of resurrected, who was George Merrick's first cousin, who was an architect and artist, another Fink. I've kind of resurrected him. He got lost in time. He was the most important original architect. And not that Phineas Pace was not important later, but that's the thing that drives me crazy, because Phineas Pace had nothing to do with the beginning of Coral Gables. It was George Merrick, George Fink, Denman Fink, and Frank Button, the first landscape architect in Florida. And I'll never forget that Eunice Merrick, I was at her house, and she said to me, "Don't forget Frank Button." And I said, "Who is Frank Button?" And I can tell you, he was lost totally there for many years. So we brought Frank Button, who's really important, back into the story. So that's the big four. And so that, I think he'd be pretty pleased. Anything else? Front row.
Why do you think it was that Coral Gables, as a planned suburban development, sort of disappeared against the background of everything else in the country? Was it because you're so far away in a far corner?
Well, I think so, and I think Miami, blossomed with the magic city, the new city, the 20th century city, blah, blah, blah. I think we were, I don't know. I think we are a long way away. You get that eastern hunk of stuff. You got Baltimore and Cleveland, New York, and blah, 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 blah. And the other place that it's Forest Hills Gardens, which is, George went to all these places with Denman Fink. He went to New York Law School. He lived in New York for a year and a half. He didn't want to be a lawyer. He was trying to please his father. And he saw the Madison Square Garden, the Geralda Tower, and Forest Hills Gardens, which was new. And it's a planned community with strict architectural controls. It's really arts and crafts. But when I went there, There's the Douglas entrance. Very, very much like the Douglas entrance. So again, you can not copying, just the wheels absorbing, absorbing all these myriad of things. Uh-huh.
In your book, you mentioned that when they first moved into the farm here, that the house flooded at one point. And I have lived in Miami over 50 years, and all over Miami is floods. Since I moved to Coral Gables 2 years ago, I am amazed that I can go out and everything drains. Even last week when we had these floods, east of 37th Avenue there was a foot of water. West of 37th Avenue there was. Did you find what this?
Yes, it's very clear. It's on the ridge. Did you see the Granada Golf Course?
Yes.
Did you go sailing on it?
Yeah. That was the only.
Well,
Where there was.
they called that the slough. And they had these sloughs in between the ridges. And so the Merricks planted vegetables on the Granada Golf Course. And the old timers told me, if you see a pine and a palmetto, it will not flood and you're on the ridge. And that is absolutely the truth, guys, I have to tell you, because pines don't like to have their feet wet. And so if you're buying a house, although the pines don't like to be sprinklered either. They don't like to be watered. But if you can see a pine anywhere. But the Granada Golf Course is what they lived off of the vegetables. And George would take a mule cart into downtown Miami, 4 hours. I'd joke and say almost as long as it takes today, 4 hours each way. And that's when he read all the great literature, 4 hours. And so I have laughed and said, and next to my Arva Parks MA, I need to write GM, because I have learned, George Merrick has educated me trying to keep up with his reading because he read constantly. I don't think I've ever known or read about anyone quite as well read as George Merrick. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all. Oh, one more back there.
Denman Fink really captures my imagination somehow. He seems to be such a visionary. Could you say a little bit about him?
Yeah, I think Denman Fink, he's another really handsome man. This family had some really, look at these pictures and I think, oh my gosh. Denman Fink, I think, had, next to George, he was the most important person in the creation of Coral Gables. George was very close to him. They kind of came from the same heritage, the Finks. Althea, that's Denman's sister, was Althea. Denman Fink was a very good artist. He cared. He did all the entrance and plazas were not done by Phineas Pace. They were done 100% by Denman Fink. He drew them. He was an artist. And then George Fink, his nephew, did any architectural. Denman Fink did Venetian Pool. Phineas Pace never breathed on Venetian Pool. And when you look at this, he did this first. This was in the paper, in a big color rendering. This is how he did things. When you look at this and you look at Venetian Pool, it is Venetian Pool. The only difference is, well, you don't see it here, but he flopped the building behind it just to give himself a background. In other words, it's on this side of the pool, not that side. But it's Denman's Venetian Pool. And I also have it documented, because one of my big rants was to get Denman Fink's name, get Phineas Pace's name, not because Phineas Pace wasn't a good architect, but Denman Fink said it was the most important thing he ever did, was Venetian Pool. And look at it, it really is. But all the entrances and plazas are Denman Fink. Uh-huh.
It seems to me that there are becoming more and more exceptions to what should be our architectural heritage here. What happens on South Granada on the waterway? There's an ultra-modern house going up, which is totally out of place. How does that get by?
Well, talk to the architectural board. It's really the architectural board has control. But most of the area south of Dixie Highway was pretty much vacant land. And the Mackle family came in there and built a lot of those ranch style, they called them at the time, the 50s houses. And so, that's a piece of history too. But there are not a lot of people excited about saving them right now. But it's north of Coral Way, even north of Bird Road, where there's a lot of really important historic Mediterranean style. That's the other thing. It's not Mediterranean revival. It's Mediterranean style. And I learned this because, again, dumb luck. George Fink's granddaughter walked in with scrapbooks of George Fink. And George Fink created the term Mediterranean style. And I have it totally documented. And he wrote it was a new style, and it was, the mixture of Moorish and Italian and Spanish. But there was nothing to revive. It was an invented new style. So that's the other thing. I say Mediterranean revival. Even the city puts it out like, even Andros does it sometimes. And it shouldn't be, but you could almost say today we have Mediterranean revival and some of the new Mediterranean. But it is Mediterranean style, and the term was invented, created by H. George Fink. That's in the book. Well, the plan was to plant grapefruit, but grapefruit, don't grow overnight. Plus, grapefruit had to be planted in the pineland. And if you've ever tried to get a palmetto out of your, and you're doing it with a hacksaw, it was very hard to clear the pineland. And they didn't have any money. And in the meantime, they used the golf course to raise tomatoes, green peppers, watermelon. So they did vegetables there. They also did a lot of avocados, which again was an exotic, and grapefruit were exotic new fruit. And some of the pictures, there's some in the book, and you've seen them. Miles of grapefruit trees. And they advertised you got a free grapefruit tree when you bought a lot. But when I lived in South Greenway, I had two old avocado trees. And I realized when I looked down that they kept going to my next door neighbor all the way down to Coral Way in a row. So some of the original, I think most of the grapefruit are gone, but I do think there's some original avocados. And they're still bearing, still growing. So it was basically exotic, and grapefruit was considered exotic.
Arva, I just wondered in your research if it was confirmed. I've always heard the story about the Venetian pool that they dug this hole and people were saying, "Oh, I don't want to buy here." That there's this ugly hole there, and I always heard that they said, "Oh well, that's why they decided to do Venetian pool." Was that confirmed?
That's true. It was their what we always call a rock pit. That's where they got their rock. And the suburb is coming together, and there's this big rock pit in the middle of the suburb. And that's when they came up with this magnificent idea to turn it. They called it lots of different things. It was called the Grotto. It was called the Venetian Lake. It was called Venetian Casino, which was the bathing casino, and so I finally got Venetian out of it. But that's very true. That's the rock pit.
How about the house that George built for his bride on Coral Way? Did it get built without a kitchen, like I heard?
No, it had a kitchen, but that's rock from the rock pit. That was 1916. He married Eunice in 1916. And I had the great privilege of going in there with Eunice Merrick. And she told me this and this and this and this and this. And the family that lived there, of course, was delighted to have her come in. Now, the other house that they built in 25 was where Roy Black lives today. That was also George and Eunice's house. And unfortunately, the city let them change it. And I didn't like that at all. But I think they were afraid that they would get sued or something by a very good lawyer. But they made some, because I also took Eunice in there because a good friend of mine was trying to restore it. And Eunice went around, and it was, until Roy Black bought it, the interior was pretty much intact as the Merricks had left it. And now it has white marble floors, and I don't want to talk about it. Okay? Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the book.
All right, folks, if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home. Still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we could ship the book to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, the book, as well as all of Arva's previous books, are for sale at the counter in the front room over there. She'll be signing here at the table to the left of the podium. I want to thank Mark Trowbridge for his introduction tonight, and please give another hand to Arva Moore Parks. Thank you very much.